It says your speaker is not working properly. Your voice can still be recorded, but the voice of the other participants cannot. How is that my speaker's fault? Try saying something now. Well, apparently I've been recording despite the fact that it gave me that pop-up notice. Well, if you have anything to say, then put it in the chat, I guess. And I'll try and figure out what on earth is going on for next time. But it might be your microphone somehow, despite the fact that my computer is telling me that it's my microphone's fault. But we'll see. For now, let's begin. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. Amen. All right, so I will read for us. So we are in 1 Samuel chapter 29. So when we last left our heroes, Saul was convinced that he is going to die in this battle, and David is sitting on the opposite side of the lines of battle, and we're kind of not sure how exactly he feels about that or how this is going to go down. It's a bit of a bad look for him, perhaps, to be fighting literally against Israel. So we'll see what happens. Now, if the title of this chapter hadn't given it away already. Now, the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is this not David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So we find ourselves in a bit of a pickle here, perhaps. I suppose it was kind of inevitable that this was going to happen, but you find David here actually with Achish, who we'll remember is the ruler of Gath, and he's met up with his other fellow Philistine lords. The Philistines had 5 major cities. The fancy Greek word for that is Pentapolis, which means 5 cities. But it appears that the rest of the Philistine lords are rejecting David because, well, frankly, they're worried that he's going to come up from behind and kill them all during battle and secretly have been on Saul's side the whole time. Now, this does not seem to be exactly what David is planning, but to be honest, we don't really know what David was planning. So it looks like, despite having become, in a roundabout way, perhaps Gath's new champion, David will be told to go home. Then Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign, for I found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." And David said to Achish, "But what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered David and said, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning, and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. So the Philistines went up to Jezreel. All right, so this is the entirety of 1 Samuel 29. It's a shorter chapter. And so we see here a bit of God's providence. No matter what exactly happened during that battle, being in it would not have been good for David. Either he would have fought on the side of the Philistines and been forced to fight against Israel, which would have been, well, a moral and political disaster, or he would have, on the other hand, perhaps tried to side with Saul, which probably would not have worked out either. I mean, Saul surely would not have accepted David, not for a long time anyways. But God sort of providentially arranges a way out for David. And we're still not entirely clear what exactly David intended to do. He's kind of got a bit of a squirrely sentence here. What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I might not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Now, who's he actually talking about? Maybe his lord the king is Achish. Maybe it's Saul. We'll see. Well, actually, we won't see because he's not going to be in this fight. That being said, it honestly looks like the Philistines have never had it better than when David was among them. The Ark of the Covenant, they took and things did not go well with them. But David seems to have had perhaps a bit of a gentler touch with them. I don't know, just as in the New Testament, God veils himself behind flesh in order to come nearer to us. Because we have Achish say some very interesting things. He says to David, as the Lord lives. And then later he says, you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. So it almost seems as if Achish has, I don't know, had a bit of a repentance, a change of ideas perhaps. But this is, as far as I'm aware, the last that we're really going to hear of him. I don't think he comes up much after this. But yes, so that's sort of where we are at the moment. Are there any questions or thoughts that you want to put in the chat before we move on to the next chapter? I think you're typing. Yeah, he's going back to, his place in the Philistines, his place among the Philistines, while they're going off to fight in Jezreel. Well, I mean, maybe he could do that. Who knows? I mean, that does seem to be like the one paradox of ancient warfare, is that you seem to kind of just get everybody and just go out there and then kind of just leave your city behind. And we'll see in the next chapter that there is kind of an inherent paradox to that makes it a bit of a problem. So we will see what happens in this next chapter. Again, the headlines do not give it away. Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag, which we'll recall is where he and his men were staying, on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negev and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So, as we were just saying, you know, it turns out that taking literally your entire military force and bringing it with you does tend to leave whatever you're leaving behind rather vulnerable. But David is finding strength in the Lord in this difficult situation. So we will see what happens now. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" He answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue." So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him. David set out and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 men stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. So David, unlike Saul, is able to inquire of the Lord and is able to get a straight answer. Interestingly, this is the second weird parallel to Saul. The last one was in the last chapter. Saul swore by the Lord, saying, "As the Lord lives," when he was talking to the medium in a very strange way, swearing something that he had no real right to swear. But then in the last chapter, we saw that Achish was also swearing by the Lord, but perhaps in a way that indicates that his heart had been changed. So as they crossed the brook Besor, they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. They gave him bread and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Kerethites and against that which belongs to Judah and against the Negeb of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." And David said to him, "Will you take me down to this band?" And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." So they've managed to find somebody who's going to lead them to that which they're seeking. So this is, in fact, well, not this, but things like this are the exact reason why David was fighting against the Amalekites earlier in a previous chapter. This is the sort of things that they would get up to, raiding border cities and people who are lagging behind, that sort of thing, and capturing them, presumably either to take them as their own wives or possibly to sell them into slavery. We don't know their exact intent. But you don't deliberately kidnap people for no reason. And we have this sort of 3 days and 3 nights. There's a sort of interesting question that you can ask where, in the New Testament, it says, that the Son of Man would be raised after 3 days and 3 nights, as it is written in the scriptures. And the question is sort of like, where exactly is that exact idea written in the scriptures? The idea that the Son of Man would, have a difficult time and be brought out of it, that might even die and be raised up. You can find that in the scriptures, but the question is, where is the idea of 3 days and 3 nights? And the answer is kind of everywhere throughout the entirety of the scriptures, because whenever any story happens in the Bible, things tend to happen in 3 days. Like that's just sort of the way that it always goes whenever anything happens in the scriptures. And so here we have this young man who has not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. They were making a raid against the Negev, that is the sort of southern desert area of the Kerethites, which is another name for the Philistines, and then against also the south of Judah and against the Negev of Caleb, which is the specific part of Judah that belonged to the descendants of Caleb. The Kerethites and the Pelethites are different. I don't know if they were different groups of Philistines or just different words for Philistines, but later we will see that David as king has seemingly a sort of independent bodyguard made of Kerethites and Pelethites. And so it doesn't, there's not like a specific like smoking gun verse in the Bible where it's like, and the Kerethites are Philistines, but every time it does mention them, you can kind of put it together and be like, oh, okay, this makes the most sense of like who exactly they would be. So, and when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing. This is the Amalekites, of course, because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines. Well, see, we have there Philistines, Kerethites, and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds and all the people that drove the livestock before him, and said, "This is David's spoil." So, as we learned in the book of Judges and also earlier in the same book, it does not matter to the Lord whether he saves by many or by few. We don't know how many Amalekites he fights, but considering that he had a group of 400 people and 400 young men fled from this battle on the other side, we can assume that the opposing force was significantly greater. And it looks like he's managed to get back everything, including perhaps more than he lost in the first place. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart." David said, "You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike." And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. And so it appears that David and his men have sort of noticed what we've noticed also, which is that it turns out that taking your entire fighting force with you and leaving nobody behind to guard things is in fact a bad idea. So on one hand, this serves as a practical morale detail. Maybe morale detail isn't quite it, but perhaps wisdom for the ancient world. But we have more going on here as well, which is that David is starting to actually act like a king. Up to this point, he has really not demonstrated any kingly qualities. I mean, he's demonstrated a bit of, uprightness in that he refuses to assassinate Saul given the chance twice. But in terms of like actually kingly qualities, he does something here, which is that he makes a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day, whenever this day is that this is written, which indicates that, David is actually taking it upon himself to make rules that people will follow. And so perhaps he senses, as well as the narrative does, that Saul is not long for this world. And in fact, probably by the time this is occurring, Saul is in fact already dead. We will find out what happens to him in the next chapter. But it is possible that David is in fact actually king at this point. Well, depending on your definition of how somebody becomes actually king. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord. It was for those in Bethel, in Ramoth of the Negeb, in Jatir, in Aroer, in Sifmoth, in Eshtemoa, in Rachel, the cities of the Jerahmeelites, the cities of the Kenites, in Hormah, in Bor Ashan, in Ethak, in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed." And so we see here the sort of ancient classical principle. You can see it in Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy. You can see it in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. That is, when you get good stuff, you gotta spread it around. Like that's the real purpose of wealth. You have to share it with the people around you and benefit everybody. But specifically also the people who are most likely to be immediately becoming your political allies. Saul is at this point probably dead. And so if he can get everybody in Judah on his side, then his transition to actually being king instead of just king, as, a matter of rights, then that will be very good for him. In fact, he's going to set himself up in Hebron pretty soon, and Hebron will be his capital until he actually is able to conquer Jerusalem. And so we find David and his men right on the cusp of actually triumphantly becoming king and people around him. As we come very nearly to the close of 1 Samuel, we only have one chapter to find out what is happening about Saul, and then we will be on the book. I will say we've gone a lot faster. Well, will this act make the Philistines his allies? Probably not. I assume you mean like dividing some of the spoil. Is that what you meant? Or was this? Well, interestingly, I'm trying to look really close. It doesn't seem like it doesn't specifically say that this is the case, but it doesn't say that David actually gave anything back to the Philistines. Now, maybe he did, but I will say it does not say that. Now, obviously, he went and got stuff that belonged to the Philistines, but what happened to that specific stuff is beyond us, or at least beyond the bounds of what is actually in the text. We will see that when David actually is king, he does have some Philistines who appear to be working as his bodyguards, although whether that has anything to do with this, or possibly his earlier sojourning among them, or whether in fact he's just paying them to be his bodyguard, it's not entirely clear. We do know that, actually, when is the last time that we hear about Philistines? Because they're kind of like the quintessential rabble rousers of this particular time. That does not last forever. I'm just gonna look that up. Yeah, that's about what I thought. The word Philistines is in 1 Samuel 100 times, 2 Samuel 24 times, and then only 3 times in 1 Kings and 3 times in 2 Kings. So at the very least, they do not get nearly as much screen time in the future. Maybe they were beaten at Jezreel. Well, I've got some bad news for all of us, which is that there's a reason why Saul dies in that battle. Um, but actually, you want to just sort of finish the book off, seeing as we've got like a whole half an hour. The last chapter is not very long. All right, let's just finish off the last chapter. We might have some stuff to say. Maybe we'll come back to it later. All right. Now, the Philistines were fighting against Israel. The men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. And the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons and his armor bearer, and all his men on the same day together. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley and those beyond the Jordan saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their cities and fled. The Philistines came and lived in them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. So they cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the lands of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. They put his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. But when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. And they came to Jabesh and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days. That is the end of 1 Samuel. So we do have some interesting parallels here, despite I didn't actually have any notes for this, but there are some interesting remarks to make. First of all, nothing spiritual to say about this, but Jonathan dies, and that's sad. He seemed to be like the only good son in this entire book and the next book. So sad to see him go. Let's see. The other interesting thing is we have a sort of interesting, I would say it's a literary parallel, but it's not actually a literary parallel because the New Testament equivalent of this is not actually in the New Testament. But it's a comparison that you can make between Saul and, of course, the Apostle Saul, which we call Paul. So Saul despairs of his life and falls on his own sword because he is afraid that these uncircumcised Gentiles are going to come and mistreat him. St. Paul in the New Testament, on the other hand, knows that it is better to be with Christ, and he does not fear death. And so he bravely goes to Rome in order to spread the gospel to Rome, and eventually is decapitated by a sword. And so they both go towards a death by the sword, but in very different ways under different circumstances. But of course, the story of Paul dying by the sword is not in the New Testament because the book of Acts finishes before then. Then we have, so the good news. This is sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind when we think about, I guess, what the word gospel means. Generally speaking, the word good news is a specific term that refers to like a great victory in battle. And so the Philistines bring this good news, their sort of Philistine gospel that they have managed to defeat the Israelites. And they bring this to the house of the idols and their people. But we have, of course, a much better good news that Christ has defeated all of these idols and all of the evil spirits through his death and resurrection. And the men of Jabesh Gilead are, of course, those people that Saul saved near the beginning of the book. And so they remembered the great favor that Saul did to them and went and got his body in order to make sure that it was shown more dignity than the Philistines were showing it. And that is the end of 1 Samuel. Do you have any thoughts or questions or ideas or I think you're in the middle of typing something. Okay. Was it normal for the Israelites to burn those bodies? That is a good question. And I'm just going to check to make sure that the men of Jabesh Gilead are actually proper Israelites. Um, hmm. Hmm. Just for a second there, I thought, were those the guys that managed to like trick themselves into like being in Israel without actually being Israelites? But I think that I'm thinking of somebody else. Yeah, no, I'm thinking of somebody else. So that is a good question. Why do they burn their bodies? Now, interestingly, they do not burn them the way that like cremation happens now, because they've still got their bones. So I think that probably what they were doing was simply burning the bodies in order to separate all the flesh from the bones, because their ultimate goal is to bury the bones. We see this also in like New Testament era burials, that there's sort of a two-stage step, not with burning, but there's a sort of two-stage step in which you bury them in one location under a specific set of conditions in order to wait until everything but the bones are gone. And then you put the bones in a smaller box and put that somewhere else. I guess this, you could say it's for storage reasons. I don't know exactly, but like basically like when they put Jesus in the tomb, if he had not been resurrected, they would not have left him in that tomb forever. They would have waited until eventually all that was left were his bones, and then they would have put the bones in an ossuary, I guess is the term for it, and then either buried that or perhaps like left it in the tomb next to a bunch of other ossuaries. I don't know exactly what you do at that point. So it is kind of interesting, and I didn't really notice until I was reading it out loud just now that they did burn the body in order to get rid of the flesh. It's possible that the reason that they did this is entirely practical, if a bit gross, which is that normally you would put stuff on the body after it had died before it got the chance to get gross. But now, because Saul had been sort of fastened to the wall, he was already gross. And so you couldn't really put any spices on him. And so they just burned the body. That's my best guess. Was it a sign of respect? That is a good question. I will say that the one other time that we hear about something sort of like this is under kind of suspect circumstances. Um, well, trying to find. At some point later in the history of Israel, we do hear about one king having some sort of fire at his funeral, but in the context, it's not entirely clear whether this is a good thing or not. The fact that like it suddenly starts mentioning it seems to indicate that it's at the very least an innovation. And then at some point it stops. And again, it's not entirely clear if this is good. I will say that the time that they stopped doing it is Jehoram. Is he a bad king? Does he remember? Yeah, he wasn't great. They didn't give him a fire. I don't know. It's not entirely clear what they were doing with that fire, I'm gonna be honest. I mean, could be that. I mean, once that's certainly true that once the flesh has been burned off of it, it's certainly not going to be obviously Saul, that's for sure. Yeah. So with this chapter, we enter into a new period of Israelite history, both in the sense that we're about to start talking about David as king, but also because this last chapter of 1 Samuel is also the first chapter of the narrative part of First Chronicles. So now, if we want to, we can occasionally check on First Chronicles to see what, if anything, the author of Chronicles has to say about these situations. Sometimes they will have something to say. Sometimes they will have nothing to say, and that in and of itself will be something interesting to say. The chronicler tends to be trying to remind everybody about how great the good old days were. And so it kind of just glosses over some of the weirder parts, not in a deceptive way, but perhaps in a way that makes it more messianic, I guess. It's like if we want a second David, then gotta really think, oh, wasn't the first David so great? Perhaps. So it hitting the highlights. Well, I guess that is the end of our study. I suppose I should lead us in a little prayer before we stop for the evening. Saul forfeits his divine blessings by compromising God's word, and he dies a brutal death at the hands of the very enemy he was chosen to defeat. There's no greater tragedy than when God's people compromise his word, no greater blessing than when they steadfastly receive it. Learn by the examples of Saul and David. By promises and blessings, the King of Heaven provides life for you in his Son, Jesus. Lord, keep us steadfast in your word. Curb those who by deceit or sword would wrest the kingdom from your Son and bring to naught all he has done. Well, I hope to see you all on Sunday. Although some of you won't be there, right? Because of Theodore? Is that the week up? Well, you might all be there. Well, that would be good. Well, I hope to see you then. Hopefully we don't get too much snow this weekend. It doesn't sound like it's going to be that bad. I will see you. Bye.